Saat ini, kegiatan penelitian di berbagai bidang memiliki tingkat ketergantungan yang tinggi terhadap data-data penelitian. Kemajuan yang sangat tinggi dalam kegiatan eksperimen yang didukung oleh teknologi komputasi telah mendorong kegiatan menggunakan dan menghasilkan data dalam volume, variasi, dan kecepatan yang sangat tinggi. Dalam era open science, data penelitian yang dihasilkan memungkinkan untuk diakses oleh peneliti lainnya, sehingga mereka dapat meningkatkan integritas dan kredibilitasnya. Kondisi penyimpanan data penelitian di Indonesia saat ini masih dilakukan secara terpisah di masing-masing institusi dan dilakukan oleh peneliti secara individual, sehingga cukup sulit bagi pemangku kepentingan di bidang riset untuk melihat sejauh mana perkembangan kegiatan riset berdasarkan data penelitian yang dimiliki dalam skala nasional. Terlebih lagi, repositori institusi sebagai wadah penyimpanan aset pengetahuan saat ini baru dimanfaatkan sebatas menyimpan karya atau publikasi ilmiah. Di negara maju yang telah berkembang kegiatan risetnya, negara memiliki tanggung jawab dalam melakukan pengelolaan data penelitian melalui repositori nasional, seperti Australia dengan ANS, Inggris dengan UK Data Service, serta Belanda dengan DANS. Pengelolaan data penelitian dengan menyimpan pada media tertentu seperti komputer, laptop, atau eksternal hard disk kurang dapat diandalkan dan beresiko untuk rusak. Selain itu, ada resiko lain yang tak kalah berbahaya, yakni hilangnya media karena pencurian. Di mana hal ini sangatlah disayangkan, mengingat data tersebut adalah hasil kerja keras selama bertahun-tahun. Oleh karena itu, penyimpanan pada repositori institusi menjadi solusi yang paling ideal. Perilaku peneliti dalam melakukan penyimpanan data penelitian sangat bervariasi. Dalam kajian yang dilakukan oleh tim PDII LIPI, bahwa selama ini peneliti melakukan penyimpanan paling banyak pada media laptop atau personal komputer dan berbagai penyimpanan eksternal. Kondisi ini diperparah dengan backup data yang dilakukan semaunya. Dalam melakukan penelitian, seorang peneliti idealnya sudah memiliki satu perencanaan manajemen data. Banyak sekali manfaat yang akan diperoleh peneliti, institusi, maupun negara ketika bisa menerapkan manajemen data penelitian dengan ideal, yakni efisiensi. Ketersediaan data pada repositori nasional akan mengurangi kegiatan penelitian yang serupa. Safety. Berbagai risiko kehilangan data yang disebabkan oleh perangkat penyimpanan dapat diminimalisir dan juga merupakan upaya untuk melindungi hak kekayaan intelektual. Quality. Repositori akan membantu peneliti untuk menjaga kualitas data dan proses kurasi memungkinkan data penelitian terpelihara sehingga dapat digunakan kembali. Reputation. Seorang peneliti akan meningkat reputasinya saat datanya digunakan kembali oleh peneliti lainnya. Compliance. Kewajiban menyimpan data yang ditetapkan penyandang dana penelitian dapat diakomodir melalui repositori institusi. Pentingnya mendepositkan dan membagikan data jika dilakukan oleh peneliti terbagi menjadi 3 keuntungan. Bagi peneliti, dapat meningkatkan reputasi dan visibilitas penelitian individu. Bagi komunitas ilmiah, dapat meningkatkan kolaborasi. Dan bagi masyarakat, mereka akan mendapatkan akses yang lebih mudah ke dunia penelitian. LIPI, melalui Pusat Data dan Dokumentasi Ilmiah atau PDDI, menginisiasi kegiatan pengelolaan data penelitian melalui sistem penyimpanan data penelitian dengan nama Repositori Ilmiah Nasional atau disingkat RIN. Dengan kapasitas yang tak terbatas, RIN mampu menyimpan dan berbagi data penelitian seluruh peneliti. RIN mampu berkontribusi dalam pemetaan perkembangan dunia penelitian. RIN, kunci kemajuan iptek Indonesia.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. We welcome you to our sixth RDM webinar series event with the theme Research Data Management, Diversity in Science, curated by PDD-LIPI, the Center for Scientific Data and Documentation, Indonesian Institute of Sciences. Today, we present to you a webinar, and we will be discussing about the research data sharing and dissemination. We have a renowned speaker with cognitive experience who will share practical knowledge on this topic. Before that, we have Mr. Hendro Subagio, who will give his welcoming speech. And the screen and the time is yours, Mr. Hendro.
Thank you, Ms. Madya Reni or Reni. Honorable Louis Corti, who works at the UK Office for National Statistics and previously worked at the UK Data Archive. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon from Jakarta, Indonesia. Good morning to our speaker who is in London, UK. Welcome to all of you at this Research Data Management webinar series, Diversity in Science, which focuses on research data sharing and dissemination. Distinguished speaker, guests, ladies and gentlemen, as you may already know, this RDM, Research Data Management webinar series, has been held 5 times in highlighting the theme of research data management and its topics that we need to upgrade as someone who works in scientific communities environment. It started from the basic foundation of how we know what is research data to the practical ones, as will be discussed today about data sharing and its dissemination. As the Center of National Repository and Depository, PDD-LIPI has essential role in managing research data and publications in Indonesia. In 2019, PDDI has launched Repository Ilmiah Nasional, or we call RIN, an Indonesia research data repository to support research data management activities, and also the open science movement in the global world. We then realized that this is a collective work. We need to prepare the human resource and standards infrastructure for demands in handling those diverse scientific works and data for the future. Here today we have Louis Corti, who will bring up one of the issues, which is data sharing. I hope we could then work together to design a great collaboration approach for the Indonesian case. All in all, good luck with the webinar, and I hope we could get many inspiration from dialogues today. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Reni.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Hendro, for your welcoming speech. And well, first of all, please again, I introduce myself. My name is Madya Reni Sulaiman, and you can call me Reni. I'm a research data librarian in PDD-LIPI, and I will be serving as your moderator today. I have also a few housekeeping notes. Today's session is being recorded to be available for viewing post-conference. You can watch this webinar live at Kepustakaan PDD-LIPI YouTube. And our presenter today will have a total of 40 to 60 minutes for their presentation. We will hold questions until the end of the session. And I will then read the question out loud for the presenter to answer. Also, if you raise your hands or choose hand emoji, you can ask your questions to the presenters on your own. You can ask about other technical issues through the chat rooms too. And as part of our webinar, we'd appreciate it if you would fill out the poll provided. This poll will be a kind of introducing the demographic of our attendees here. So I will start to launch the poll. If you can see the poll, the titles is Know You Better. It means that we want to know who's the participants that attending this webinar today. The first question is, what is your role in your institutions? Are you librarian, researchers, academicians, students, or others? And do you produce research data? I'm asking about if you are doing research, or maybe you just being a student, or maybe librarian who also interested in doing a research. Are you managing research data? So the first question is, have you used RIN data first, the Indonesian Research Data Repository? It means that if you use that, you also know about the movement that we do that in introducing the research data management concept to Indonesia. The last question is, have you used research data repository other than RIN data first? So if you're researchers or you are a librarian, you might know some repository or institutional repository that have been used worldwide or national, or if you're working in the maybe academic institutions, you have the institutional repository that store some of the works or publication that are produced by our lecturers, etc. So this poll will know you better how many attendees and how's the demographic of the attendees here. Maybe I can start to end the poll. So if we can see together the role if the institutions that attendees have is the librarian. So almost 81% of them are librarian and 19% of them are researchers. Some of them also academician and students. The other thing is, are you producing research data? So if you attend this webinar, of course, you know that you have an interest, special interest to research data. And some of them, most of them are like 71% producing it. The other thing is, are you managing research data? And most of them also managing it. We can see that managing in this term is can be mean like, are you analyzing the data for your research, your own research, or are you giving services to some people, or some maybe you are academic librarian and you help maybe students or lecturers to manage their data. And the fourth question is, most of them haven't used RIN data first. Well, that's quite some message that we need to show to Pak Hendro and other team to also socialize about RIN data first to the Indonesian people and also to the global world. The last one is, have you used a research data repository other than RIN data first? Yeah, so most of them also haven't used other research data repository, and you can know more about it in the last webinar, in the last 4 webinar or 5. We introduced some research data repository to other people like researchers or other professional in the scientific communities to also know about if you're working in the nuclear area or social science area, you have a unique data repository that offered by some global institutions. You can check it from read3data.org. It is a research data indexer that you can use to check if you are you have the data repository specifically to the some disciplines. Well, actually, we're still waiting for Louis to come to the room, but I think she has some difficulties in the connections. I will try to reach her for a minute. So if I can ask Pak Hendro before, I'm sorry, because we are still waiting for Louis to join the room. We
Okay.
can just ask Pak Hendro first.
Okay.
What do you think about the last 5 RDM webinar series that we have held before? We have so many approaches, like starting from DDMP, data management and planning, and then how people in the specific area, specifically in the biodiversity research, managing their data.
Okay, I think our webinar in 5 times we have new insights that before this we don't even know what we will do, what we have to do. But after this 5 webinars, we have some new insight that we have to plan carefully about DMP, because there is not only technical issues but also psychology issues, human issues gitu. And if we talk about biodiversity, this most interesting theme that I have know. This a lot of issues about how to manage specimens, and also how to digitalize. There's some new issues that we have we know. Maybe this is our my experience, my new knowledge that I can grab from speakers. This very interesting and very best experience that I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hendro. So because we have the RDM webinar series, this is the 6th RDM series, and maybe the last one in this year, because it's at the end of the year, talking about data sharing and disseminations. And now Louis has comes to the room, and now we can just moving right along to our session. We have Louis who will be speaking to us on research data sharing and dissemination. Before she gives this presentation that we have been waiting for, let me give you some information about her background. So Louise is the head of Insight, Development and Impact for the Secure Research Service at the Office for National Statistics. She has worked in data services for over 30 years and spent 20 years as Associate Director of the UK Data Archive, where she directed a broad range of activities within the social sciences, from collection development, data publishing, data governance, and user services and outreach and training. She has a background in social survey design, methods, and analysis, and pioneered the practice of qualitative data archiving, establishing the Qualitative service in the 1990s. Wow. So she has held research grants and published in the areas of research data management and capacity building in data and statistical literacy. She also supported many new initiatives around the world to help establish their own data services. You can check her personal webpage and publication at Google Scholar and Orchid, and also you can explore her books titled Managing and Sharing Research Data, A Guide to Good Practice, published by CJ Publication. We are so glad to know you and have you in our webinar, Louis. If I can say, where are you now, right now?
I'm in North Yorkshire in England, actually on holiday. So I'm in a beautiful part of the world that's very green and rolling. So yes.
Yeah, and it's very nice to meet you, because the last time we met, it was in 2019 at some data wrangling training from the University of Edinburgh. So it's very nice to meet you again.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, without further ado, please, Louis, the time on the screen is yours. You can try to share the screen.
Thank you. Just first of all to say thank you so much for inviting me. And it's really nice to be part of a community that are doing so well. So your video really inspired me to see how far you've got. And you know, it looks like you're really on a very good journey with data sharing. So it's very nice to be part of that journey. Okay, I'm going to switch my video off because of my connectivity, and I'm going to share my screen. Just let me know when you can see it okay. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, that's okay.
Good. And can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk about research data sharing and dissemination, and I know I'm the sixth speaker, and you will already have heard some fantastic insight from other speakers on data management planning and kind of data sharing in science. I'm really going to be focusing on sort of social science and some of the practical experiences that I've been through sort of in my career to make sure that, you know, it's fine just to set up a repository, but then keeping it, having the right staff, gaining the momentum in your country is it's probably quite a challenge to do. But I would say that we've got a very good story in the UK. I think we've come quite far. So I'll take you through some of the more practical elements. So I'm going to be covering these things, a little bit about importance, although your video has already told us why it's so important, and the reason you're at this webinar is because you want to be part of the building of the culture. There is the thing about, you know, how do you build trust and culture? What's some practical tips for doing that? Some innovations that have gone on in the research data sharing landscape, and currently what we're doing at my own Office of National Statistics. So your video talked very nicely about the data sharing benefits. I'm not going to really go over them too much more, but data is really very expensive to collect. We know that if you do a large scale survey or a piece of qualitative work, it's very expensive. It's people's time and effort. And it's very sad that, you know, if it's not reused for other people, then it becomes a terrible waste. And in some senses, if we are thinking about, you know, work that was done in the 1980s that can never be done again, it very much becomes part of our historical record. So we do need to keep this stuff. Also, there's a lot more kind of collaborative projects going around the world using similar methodologies, cross-national surveys. We have to have a really good data sharing program in place. We have to have that so that we can collaborate. I do feel it accelerates science. And I think actually one of the things I've noticed from my work is actually sharing the methodology. The detailed methodology, which is often part of documentation, is as important as sharing data. So showing how people got through a gate, to interview people, showing the techniques, the sampling, all that stuff is really, really important. And quite often it's not shared in social science. If you go to a journal piece, you very rarely see very much about the methodology at all. So I think that whole package of documentation is probably one of the most important things that will survive over time. And of course, we know the research transparency agenda is coming quite fast. There's a whole load of, you know, a drive to be more reproducible, and that means sharing data and sharing, you know, what we've done as part of our research. So there's been lots of drivers in Europe, I really think, for the last sort of 10 to 15 years. You know, there's a worldwide momentum for sharing data and openness. There's lots of sort of mandates, the OECD mandate to share data. Probably coming up for 20 years now. There's a lot of professional societies, for example, the Society of Sociology and Anthropology and Economics, certainly in the UK. Now they're kind of practical guidelines for researchers all talk about open science and talk about data sharing, whereas 10 years ago they didn't. In fact, when we went to look back at the kind of psychology guidelines, it was you really must destroy all of your data because it presents a risk, and that's very much changed. That narrative has changed, which is a good thing. In the UK, we've got a really big drive towards research integrity, and I think there's worldwide conferences on that as well, but particularly within universities, we have every university signed up to this Concordat to support research integrity, which means making sure there's positive benefits of doing science really well. You know, about making sure people are not cheating or faking data, and part of that is also around sharing data. In the UK, all of our grants, the bodies who give out grants, and this is Research Councils UK, it's a confederation of all the people who give grants out. They have some common principles on data policy, and that's kind of high level subscription for all of the different disciplines to make sure that they agree to these sort of top 10 policy points. And we also, within our parliaments, you know, we've been very worried in the UK and Europe about cheating, about faking. There's been a lot of faking of data and fraud in particularly in the Netherlands, and there's been a lot of work to make sure that's not going to happen and that we can have better trust. So in a way, that's a negative thing for data sharing. We don't want that to happen, but for those of us who are sharing data, it's one of those arguments we can start to bring in around research integrity, rather than this, please share your data because it's a really nice thing to do, which obviously it is. So yeah, reproducibility is again a big deal in the UK at the moment, and you know, it's always been held to be a kind of quite a clear thing that you should do in quantitative methods. And more journals now, and that's including international journals, you'll know, have data sharing mandates, have data availability statements you have to fill in. Some of them require you to submit your code and have it run. The International Journal of Political Science and Economics, you have to have all your code rerun. And that means you've got to be very organized and share that part of the data. And then I've been, before I moved to the Office of National Statistics, I was very much working on some of the qualitative research side, the data sharing side. And there was a lot of worry from qualitative researchers about what happens if we have to be reproducible. What does that mean? You know, our data is very sensitive. We can't show the reproducibility. You can't just run our code. There's been a big debate about what that means. I think we're still in debate. It's not decided yet. But I think as part of that, I've always said to researchers, you can try and at least share the methodology. You know, share what you've done, share how you did it, show your topic guides, just so you can go a little bit further than saying, I don't want to be reproduced. So just to say in the UK, just to date back a little bit as to where we've come from, I was part of the working group that helped set up a research data policy in '95, and it seems like such a long time ago. But we went to the Research Council, we said, we think you need a data sharing policy, and they put one in place very early. And that included all kinds of research within the social sciences. So this was the Economic and Social Research Council. So it included all aspects of social science from economics right through to kind of humanities type social science. And as part of that, a data service was set up, actually set up in the 1960s, but in '95 it became more of a policy thing. So you had a grant, you had to deposit your data or offer your data to the UK Data Archive. And so as a consequence of that, many data started coming in. In the 1970s, the Data Archive had a very good relationship with the Office of National Statistics, where I work now, to have a place to host the data for academics. Because the government departments really did not want to use it, they didn't want to deal with academic users. The Data Archive became a really good repository for them to come and use data. And as part of that sort of journey for the UK Data Service, there's now over 1,000 qualitative collections, and I think we're very proud of the fact that researchers feel very comfortable to put data in there. There's been a lot of advocacy. You don't just get that, you have to work very hard for that, to have lots of seminars like this and webinars on benefits, drawing in people to show why they've done this, providing case studies, and I'll talk about some of those very practical things a little bit later. I think one of the big boosts in the UK was that in the mid 2000s, for about 8 years, there was a programme of investment where actually thousands of pounds, probably millions of pounds, went into a fund that universities could use to try and come up with different forms of data sharing, advocacy programmes, training programs, online training, setting up repositories, looking at repository software and integration with some of their CRIS systems. It was very creative, and it had a very inspirational person running that. And I know that I got 2 grants out of that to do research data management training, which then led to our book. But I think that's what really helped the UK really move very quickly. And I would say, that's, 20 years later, I would say data sharing is quite acceptable. I think where people can, they, rather than trying to fight it or say, I don't do that, it's part of the culture, which is good. And it means I can probably retire now because I feel like it's being done. And 20 years ago, it was very frustrating that nobody was sharing anything. You'll all know about fair data. I don't need to say much more, but these are some of the things that we strive to be. We want our data to be findable. We need to find it, and the internet really helps us with that, obviously. Accessible in formats that can be opened in now and in 20 years' time. Interoperable, where we can actually start to federate our catalogs and find things and contribute information to portals. And it needs to be reusable. And I think for me, if I was going to choose any one of those things, it would be the last one. As a researcher myself, not currently, but having a research background, I want to know everything about the data. I want to know the methodology, the codes, everything as much as I can. And it needs to be something that, as well as a file I can open, I understand everything that goes with it, and it's very well documented. And I think actually the reusable is the biggest challenge. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And I'm sure you're perhaps finding that in your RIN repository about what quality of documentation is going in there. So I think the data service, I worked there for a very long time, 20 years. It was part of my life and helped to shape it. But I do think they're in a very good place. I think the repositories work very well. They have DOIs attached to them. They're very good at promoting data and also running a lot of workshops and opportunities for researchers to show how to use the data. And I think those kind of guides, data guides, tutorials, webinars, self-paced learning materials are very important. And that helps also support reproducibility. And I think some of those approaches have been widely used, which is really nice too. I'm just going to check to see if you can hear me okay.
Yeah, we can hear you okay.
Hear me okay? Yes, so I just heard a noise, so I'm a bit worried about. Good, okay. So in terms of kind of findable, the UK Data Service has just actually changed its website, and I know that was in design before I left. It's quite easy to find and locate data by theme or by the type of data, or searching on some of the biggest data sets. It's very straightforward to do that. And I think as well as having a big catalog, having these browsing ways in is very good for new users. And then ethical and legal, obviously you'll know, that's a very important part, that we can only share data that we are allowed to share, and that whole kind of framework of research ethics that most researchers will work with when they're doing research is now extended to working with what you do with data when you hold it. So not only during your project, but afterwards as well. And certainly in the UK and in Europe, we have this general data protection regulation, and that has some really good rules around how we actually work with personal data. And there's always that challenge about, is the data personal? Is it not personal? Trying to make that decision about what's anonymous and what's personal can be very, very difficult. And I think always kind of erring on the side of caution, that you put some protective measures in place for your data where you think there is a risk, or you think there is a legal challenge. So I'm not going to go into that now, but we can perhaps discuss questions if there are some. So I always think there's a terrible confusion in the world of open science between all these words. And you often hear that people say, well, open research means open data, we can't do it. And we know, and you'll know as an audience, it's not the case at all. Open research and open science is the willingness to do your research in an open way, a transparent way, where you're not going to hide anything. Open data is literally data that can be an open access, things you can get for no money or can get very easily without too many barriers, and they're not the same thing. You can have open research, but some of your data can be locked away. It might be difficult to get because of the nature of the data. So I just think it's a fundamental confusion that I often see in my daily work. So I think it's always worth stating that open access and open data are different things to the practice of open research, but we want our data to be as open as possible where it can be, but without compromising the data and the subjects itself. So most places, and certainly the data service, we've used these three categories for absolutely years, that you have your open data that's completely open, anyone can use it for any purpose, and we don't know what they're doing with it. But we really hope they're doing good things, and we really hope they'll use DOIs and they will cite the data once they've used it, but you can't force them to do that. And then most of the data, the UK Data Service will be in the middle category, probably about 95% of it. And that means you have to register with the system and you sign agreements. And and you might decide some data within the system is locked down for 5 years, or there might be extra agreements for some data that the depositor wants to put in place. And then the controlled is having a proper controlled environment that I'll speak about at the end, and that's where I work at the moment. And that's allowing us to share large amounts of administrative data, registered data, government data in a very safe way. And certainly we found really with COVID in the last 18 months that there's been far more data coming on stream for researchers to use within a controlled environment. So I like this word process transparency. I've always found, you know, transparency is quite a general term. The word process transparency is different from analytical transparency, where you're asked to kind of rerun code and retrace every single step to get to the findings that you read in a paper. That's kind of analytical transparency. I think process transparency is really around how you got the data, you know, how you went out and you collected everything. And as I said before, if you go to a research article, you don't really find anything about the research methods. It's very sanitized and clean, and everything went well. And we know as researchers, things rarely go well. There's always hiccups and problems and changing of plans. And we should say something about that, you know, something about the difficulties in doing things that we were going to do, and describe how we got around it and how we did it. So I think those sort of descriptions are really important, but researchers often feel they don't want to write that, or they don't have time to write that. So the documentation side about what people have done to collect data, to clean it, to iterate it, to derive variables or derive pieces or anonymize, all that stuff, you know, needs to be available where it can be. And part of our role as, you know, data disseminators is really to give very clear instructions and show people how to do that. And again, these user guides can be very useful devices for helping, you know, a user flip through a kind of booklet to see how this was done, to tell the story of the data. And I think when it comes to replication data sets, particularly in economics, it's sometimes you've got a very small data set with, you know, 5 or 6 variables in. I really think there needs to be a link to the original data, so you can actually go back and retrace that replication data set. But I think this is the biggest challenge of data sharing, is getting this documentation so that it's good enough, it's sufficient to be able to use the data without saying, well, I don't know what this variable means, and then it's perhaps used incorrectly. So a very big challenge, and perhaps we can talk about how that's going with your repository later. Just an example of the UK Data Service, it has a whole documentation area and sort of prepares materials as much as possible. I know when I worked there as the head of acquisitions, we just said, just give us everything you've got and we'll prepare it, you know, as much as you can share, consent forms, everything you can. This is a qualitative collection here, but just give us everything, including the report that you wrote for your funder. It's all very useful material, because quite often the report for the funders, you know, for the original application and the final report will tell you a lot about why somebody conceived the research idea and what they did. And then I think this kind of review, to let people know how you're going to review a data set when it comes in, to have guidelines on that, at least people can see what you're going to check. So they can say, well, obviously you're going, this is the qualitative review process at the data service. You're going to check the files, you're going to check the projects to make sure these things can be ticked off. So therefore, you've got to meet all of these requirements. And I think that's very important to summarize that for people so they can see. So you can have that right up front in the repository, say what's going to be reviewed. And also there's various tools now around to do sort of fair reviewing of data, to ask particular questions of the fair, or for each data set too. I think it's interesting that research data management's always kind of been aimed at, you know, professional researchers or maybe early career, but I know that we did a lot in our university at University of Essex to do some training and put together a pack for students. Actually, these were undergraduate students, so they're 18, 19, and the sociology department came to us and said, look, we really think these people are going to be doing their dissertation, you know, in their final year, in their third year. We'd like to tell them something in their second year about what's going to be expected when you do a dissertation. You're going to be collecting data, you're going to be maybe interviewing people, doing a survey. let's have a really step back and have a really simple introduction. So we put together a pack. I had two of my young staff who've just finished their PhDs actually write the material, so they were in touch and they gave the seminars, and they really felt in touch with the students and themselves, because some of them were doing graduate teaching. And we put together a pack, and it went down very, very well. So it's kind of research data management light. That pack's available. You can just use it, adapt it, and the PowerPoint slides are there as well. And I think we tried this out quite a few times so that it really worked for the students, and the students really engaged with it. So it was a really nice experience. Yes, so what are the kind of best practices in sharing? What do we need to do? And I'm sure you've done many of these with your repository, and I'm sure researchers will probably realize this, but you know, you need to be part of a community, and that's what you've built here, the community, to make sure you keep in touch with progress, to see what other people are doing, go to conferences. And I know I went to conferences for years, some of the data sharing conferences, just to keep track of what others were doing, to maybe do some collaboration, to look at new tools, to look at just new innovative ways to pick up. So there's a lot of very good sharing of resources, guides, approaches in our community. It's a very open community, so I think that's really nice. There's a lot of inexpensive tools available, you know, free tools for data sharing, for data management planning, and they can just all be picked up and used and adapted, and nobody minds anyone doing that. So it's a very good community. There's a lot of very good guidance out there now. I think in the 1990s when we started, there was no guidance at all, so we basically had to write a lot of it, and it's really nice to see a lot of the materials that are based on some of the early thinking that we did in the 1990s. So we were very open. I've certainly always been very open about sharing all my materials, you know, so people can just use them. I think that's a really nice frame of mind to have, to be very open and share. I think you get more from sharing than you do from holding things. And then advocacy, obviously showing some of the examples, you know, working with researchers who want to be early adopters. I would always say, come forward, early adopters. We'll showcase you, we'll use your name. And we always had 2 to 3 researchers early on who we always brought into seminars and used their names. And I think they've probably got quite famous because of that. So having people who are, you know, who want to be used as sort of guinea pigs, but also want to open to showing what they've done, I think is really nice and inspiring as well. And that's, you know, that can be younger people in the midst of their research, and much older people on the verge of retirement who want to tell people about their kind of life stories and what they've done in their data journeys. And so the champions, I think some of the very important people, the champions, is important too. And I'm sure, well, obviously you do have some already, so that's really nice. Just say a little bit about resources. As I said, there's lots of really good resources you can use for showing people how to use data, and that is important as well. You can have a big repository of stuff, but you also need to supplement that with, you know, how to use these things, showing how data has been used, you know, showing people how to do very specific things where there are problems or where there's barriers. So some of those, trying to find out from researchers what the challenges are in actually using data can be important as well. And again, it's very good to engage with, I think, teachers of research methods we found to be some of the strongest advocates. So we used to run webinars with quantitative methods teachers and qualitative methods, and you'd have a lot of people coming on the calls to find out about sort of sharing ways of how they teach with data and using some of these resources. And then we'd often work with them to create teaching packs or teaching materials. And it's often the case that some of these teachers, lecturers, have written really good instructional materials themselves. They're really inspirational, and trying to get them to share that a bit more widely, I think is really nice. There's some very creative people out there, certainly. And then there's a whole web page on the data service about teaching ideas that can be used and reused. So I think they're nice. I'm going to talk a little bit about my current work in the last sort of 15 minutes. And I work for the Office of National Statistics. And there's, you know, national statistical institutes in every country, and we all probably pretty much do the same things. But, you know, some are much bigger and are more open to data sharing. Others are doing the business of government and producing national statistics. but I'll take you a little bit inside the engine about what we're doing with our Secure Research Service. So we have this concept of the 5 safes, and I'm sure you might have heard of that, but that was actually a term that was coined by somebody in ONS years ago in the early 90s, Felix Ritchie. And he actually still is a consultant for the ONS, and we still work with him, and he helps lead some of the training. But this idea of the 5 safes is very important. So you need a number of different safety measures around you to help protect data. So obviously data, the safe data is very important, and we currently work with lots of different data sets, as well as our own statistics and surveys that we produce. We also work with other government departments who are who have information databases on social security, on health, on hospitals, on or people's health records, people's education records, their experience at school. So all of those administrative data sources are part of government departments' records. And there's been a lot of work to try and make some of those into data sets that researchers can use, and that's really important. And I think it's gone incredibly well in the UK, actually. We've always been a little bit behind countries like Scandinavia and Netherlands, who have these registers, and they've turned them into data sharing resources. They have very small populations, and they've done that for a long time. It's much harder for countries who haven't done that to be able to share administrative data in that way. But it's all around having the kind of legal powers to do that. And I'll tell you a little bit about our Digital Economy Act. It's been a very important legal act that's helped us create these data and share them legally. So it's been really important. And that includes linking very important data sources together in the UK, linking education records with work records, with university records, with work records, so that you've got a trajectory of people's histories, and you can look at outcomes really well. So just an example of some of the data sets, the surveys that we have. I'm sure you'll probably have labour force surveys and censuses. We have a lot of surveys in the UK that we've had for years, and many of them are ongoing. And obviously we have our birth and mortality data, and it's about telling stories with those data, trying to link some of those sources together. And then on the other side, there's a lot of other surveys that we actually curate and make available for other government departments. And the one that's called the longitudinal education outcomes is a really important new data set. I think it's actually one of the best data sets I've ever seen myself. And it's linking young schooling records with, so children all the way from 5 to when they finish school, to university, to their work. And that's a really long, it's a fantastic longitudinal study that's population based. So it's very, very important. But obviously, providing access to that stuff comes with a lot of gates around it, and governance matters. There's a lot of very, very important data sets, and increasingly so, with COVID, because everything's changed so much, the shape of the economy, the shape of the health service, we have business surveys where actually tracking businesses as well to see how they're doing sort of during COVID and post-COVID. So surveys have still been very important, as well as some of these administrative data sources. So part of the SAFEs is safe projects, and this means that anything that's any idea for research has to go through a kind of a checking process. So not only does it have to fit in with the legal constraints around whether you can use the data or not, there's a lot of vetting and checking and feasibility checking, and then a panel that's actually signing off on whether this research can be done or not. So there's a whole ethical framework that I think is a very good framework. Actually, it's called it's a ethics self-assessment tool. You can go and have a look at it, run by our UK Statistics Authority, and it's really a very good tool for checking the ethical picture of your data, of your research. And it's one of, actually, having worked in ethics for years, this is the most straightforward tool. It's like a spreadsheet, and you go through and you code how you are on a scale, and it gives you a red, amber, green rating on ethics. So it's a very, very good tool, and that is used, and some of our staff go through and help the researchers fill this in. So the project part's very, very important, that we can do the research for the purpose, for a correct purpose, and that the outcome's going to be important rather than just data mining. And then safe people, this is a part where we need to train, make sure the researchers who are going to use the data are fully trained. They have to go through an accreditation process. They have a course that they do, which is, it used to be a day's course. It's actually online now, it's 2 to 3 hours. And then they have to take a test that shows they understand disclosure control, statistical disclosure, what that means, like low cell counts. And so, and there's a requirement to have done some statistics to be a little bit experienced. Even if it's like a course you've done, or you've done a dissertation in numeric work. So you can't just go in and do it unless you've got some background. And then there's a whole load, there's a safe room or a safe environment they go in, they have to be trained how to do that as well. So there's quite a little bit of getting the people ready to be able to use the data. And then outputs, so they're basically using the data within a secure environment. Anything that comes out of that environment has to be checked. So they can't take anything out that will breach the rules. So the outputs will be statistical tables or regression estimates, but they're all checked by 2 staff to make sure that we're really not releasing anything that's going to put people's confidentiality at risk. It's a very expensive service to run, but we have thousands of researchers in there, and there's a lot of money being put into servicing this because the data's felt to be really important. But there's an overhead to keeping the service running. And then the safe setting, this used to be, you know, old-fashioned safe room, but it's making sure that the environment in which you're using data is controlled. There's restrictions, or you can see the restrictions on the left. So you can't have internet connectivity. It'll kind of be a dumb terminal you'll be working with. Everything is logged and captured, all the key logging. There's auditing, CCTV. So it's actually quite a controlled lockdown approach. And then there's various standards that we work to, and security protocols and audits as well. So it's quite heavily audited. So you know, there's enough controls in there to say that we think it's a really safe place to work with unsafe data, because it's disclosive data. It's not open data at all. And then so the very safe settings, I think in the old days, even actually up to 5 years ago, you had to go onto a site at the Office of National Statistics. There's like 3 to 4 sites in the UK. You had to travel to one and work in there. And sometimes there was these safe rooms within government departments, but now there's a remote access. So there's a whole load of vetting that can be done of the researcher's own office to make sure that their office is a safe place to do this research. And that's opened up the doors to many more researchers, which is great. And obviously, in COVID times when people couldn't go to work, that's been absolutely instrumental in people going to their offices, getting permission to go, but also we had a temporary home working in place with extra governance to make sure people could then VPN into their office and do some work from home. And that's been a temporary thing in place, but it's trying to be adaptable during difficult times. So just a little bit about our Digital Economy Act, because I think it's a very important act, and you can go and look at it later, but it's really open. It's around the kind of digital space. So it has a lot about online things and just making sure that the use of the internet is sort of controlled and everything, and in the best way. But there's also, and it's also about kind of access to broadband. You know, so people have got connectivity in the UK. There's lots of different things. But part of it's been about having a strand for research to be able to take place, and that's been really important. That's strand 5. And so it's called a permissive gateway to enable public authorities to make information available to researchers for the purpose of research in the public interest. It's a bit of a mouthful, but we know what that means. It means where we're going to do good, and there's important, you know, the research is going to help policies or improve national services. This is a gateway to do that, and hence all those checks that we saw around, well, how are you going to make this meet the public interest test? So it's a really important gateway that we've had since, it's been in operation since about 2018. And we have a UK statistics authority that kind of looks after that. And it oversees this accreditation process. So it's the accreditation that makes this work in a very robust way. So a little bit about accreditation. I think it is quite a clever way of enacting this act and making it work. So first of all, there was the kind of there's different types of accreditation. There's the researcher accreditation, to make sure that the researchers are fully trained, and once they go on the training and take this test, they become an accredited researcher for 5 years. They go on a public list and their name is there, and they're called an accredited researcher, and they can use that status like a passport to go and use other secure environments. So it's a really nice thing to have. I went through it myself. It's not that bad, but it's just doing a little bit of groundwork to make sure you can pass the test. And then we have the research project accreditation. So when your project is vetted and checked, it goes through a panel. It's called the Research Accreditation Panel, and your research becomes accredited. So it's a proper project that will be monitored, but it's allowed to take place because it meets all these criteria. And then the processes are the environments where this is going to take place. And the ONS, my own organization, had its secure research service accredited as an environment that's going to fit all of those needs. It's quite a big process it has to go through to have everything checked, but it becomes an accredited processor. So you've got these 3 accreditations that work together to make sure we are doing the research data sharing and dissemination safely. And just a little bit about the kind of public good. There's these sort of 6 areas really that you have to meet, that have to meet this kind of public good assessment. So it has to have clear benefits, and the identity has to be kept, you have to consider the confidentiality. Is there new risks of technologies, things like machine learning? Are the outcomes going to be transparent enough? So there's lots of stuff around methods as well as around kind of the data itself, the legal compliance, whether or not, there's a lot of public engagement done to make sure the public are okay with this stuff. So we don't just set up an act and do it. There's a lot of public panels and things to make sure that the kind of narrative is explained and people have a chance to say how they feel about it as well. So it's a very important, and all of this narrative can be used by other people. I think it's very useful. I'm not going to go into this, but we have a research, you can look at it later. We have a journey to show people the process of getting your project accredited. So each stage, you actually do the training, you go through, you get your project done, your data set gets put in a place for you, the data that you're allowed to have. You go in the environment to use it, and then you have your outputs. So that's the data sharing journey, but I won't go into that into too much detail. But it has each element of the SAFEs takes you through the journey, and then hopefully you'll end up doing some really good research, outputting some tables and statistics, and then you can use that in your publication, and that's kind of the end of the journey. Just to give you something around numbers, I think at any one moment we have, actually we've got 1,000 at the moment, but we have around 600 live projects. That means people can dip in and out and use them. 4,000 accredited researchers who are currently active researchers, or they're still on the list. Every 5 years they have to go through re-accreditation, they have to take the test again. There's about 100 accessible data sets, and these are the surveys with the disclosive information. It's the very low level geographies normally, or very detailed information. And there's administrative linked data sets in there as well. And then we clear about 2,000 outputs. So we have about 7 or 8 staff that do all the checking. 2 people have to check each of the outputs, and cleared around 2,000. It's a very, very busy time. And certainly during COVID, with some of the COVID data sets, the health ones, people were working overtime to help service the amount of information coming out that was then going to government departments to help make decisions on what to do in the UK. A little bit about, I'm just going to show you this very quickly, but you can see that about over half of our researchers are academics, but there's also people from the public sector, from government departments, from charities, and from local government. And then, the private sector is allowed in as well. They normally do work with academic researchers together. And then in terms of popularity, you can see from the period this year, actually education data was being used the most. And just to give an example of some accredited projects, we have a big COVID infection survey we set up last year. It was rapidly used, And it was an ongoing project that a rather large group of researchers were working on to make sure it was actually sampling people every month, the same people around levels of infection in the UK. So there was a team working on that constantly within the environment. We have one on criminology in Northern Ireland. We have one on national living wage and the impact of that. And then one on apprenticeships. So quite a variety of kind of projects that are going through, but they're all important for, you know, for services and for policy. And then a little bit about when we asked people about whether the environment was kind of useful, I think we found that quite a lot of people felt that the environment's been very useful to help them collaborate with departments or other academics, just because conceptualizing your project in that way means you have to talk to people to get a really good project planned in the first place. You need to be talking to policymakers or government departments or others who work in the space. You can't just decide to do research and get it agreed in a kind of solitary way. So there's a lot of collaboration that's needed. And then a lot of people felt that actually by going through this process and being accredited and working in accredited environments, that helped them provide, you know, new knowledge. They improved their coding skills, their analytical capability. They had to, you know, improve those skills as well. They became better at sort of managing data and had an awareness of disclosure risk and ethics. So I think they're definitely positive views. I'm just going to go on to this one to say we have a really good initiative in the last year and a half, good health data research, and it's brought together all the different health data providers, and it's brought them together in one portal, so we all feed in health data sets. That's been very important, and COVID has been an accelerator, but also there's hubs for cancer, for dementia, and it's been a big investment from our Medical Research Council and other bodies to help provide this environment. So it's all in one portal, and it's really very nice. And a TRE is this trusted research environment, which my own service is. They all use these 5 SAFEs frameworks. They're all very similar. There's probably about 10 of them, but they're all working together to provide data into this environment. So it's really nice to see the systematic approach here. And just to say that, you know, I don't know if you're going to have a secure lab or if you're working in that area at all, but there's a really good grassroots group called Safe Data Access Professionals, which I know some of my colleagues at the data service help run. And there's various, they meet every month and they, you know, help new people start, people who are trying to run these secure labs who've never had training for it. They do a fantastic little handbook, and they run sort of seminars and things on various aspects of the job. So it's a really nice grassroots network, I think, within UK. And then just finally, part of my job is I'm head of development and insight, and I work with the researchers to help them, show them why their research is good. So we have these excellence awards every year, and people submit their research, their projects, and we go through and we have a panel, an independent panel. So my team have just been triaging all the entries at the moment, and we'll be having an award ceremony. And that really showcases the best of research. We have different categories of awards, and we have an overall award. We have a program award, so that would be, you know, somebody who's done a lot of lots of strands of work under one theme. We have an early career researcher award, so those who are new, who've actually led a project. And we have a use of linked administrative data award as well, so that's quite specific. So they're really lovely things to do, and as I said before, having these kind of showcasing events, I think is very, very important. And just finally, on my last slide, really, obviously, you know, governments have got to do better. We are actually, you know, everything's very much, each government department does something a little bit differently. There's now a federated solution coming where we're trying to make it easier and safer to do research within one environment, an integrated data program. So instead of all the government departments having lots of different analytical units and having their own secure environments, it's going to be one that's safe, can be utilized by everyone, and it will have the 5 SAFEs approach. So we're not going to just store data in there for everyone to use. It'll be you can only use the data you're allowed to use. But again, it's got some what's called analytical lighthouse projects going through that are based on quite large data sets, and it's using cloud technologies. And we also have a really interesting data science campus as part of ONS that helps train up researchers for the future within government. So It's a really nice thing, and very proud to be part of Office of National Statistics as well. So that is me. I have finished my talk, and I'm more than happy to answer questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lois. I hope you all enjoy these amazing presentations. And we have some questions, but I would like to have some short recap. And you're mentioning about UK investment on RDM practices. It's really interesting because Indonesia itself, we try to invest some human resources, infrastructure, and also regulations. And some frameworks also introduced. And there is a confusion of terminology about, we know about UNESCO recommendation on open science. We hope that recommendation can also make us to be in sync about how do we see about open science. And there is also understanding of data itself. Is it a personal one? Is it open? Is it research data or security data? And also you share about your current work at UK Office National Statistics. And this one, the accreditation one, is very interesting. So I hope that many people are get inspired about your presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we can go to the next session about the question and answer time. So some questions already put here on the Q&A tab. Someone asking about, you mentioned about research integrity. Is the sharing of data included in the common research ethics in the UK itself?
Yes, I think it is. Yes, I mean, certainly the research integrity has come from a slightly different angle. It's around looking at all aspects of integrity. So it includes ethics, includes doing research well, subscribing to kind of honesty policy, and subscribing to being more transparent yourself as a researcher, and also includes things like penalties if researchers do things wrong on purpose. So that's never been in there, but there's a whole load of kind of principles that we're supposed to subscribe to, and most universities have kind of signed up to that. But certainly ethics has always been around, hasn't it, in research? And I think most professional societies will always have the ethics component in. But I think this goes a little bit further to say, it's not, we know that you do ethics well, but you need to do everything else well too.
Yeah, certainly. To the next questions. What do you think about the gold standard in data sharing? He or she means that the science is so diverse that we then need it to be at least readable by third parties. So is there any discussion of the community of practice who represents each discipline in sharing the data?
I think probably there is, but it's not very visible. I would say if you asked me to nominate those people, I could probably, talk about people like Sarah Callahan. There are people who've been around this a long time. There's not obvious advocates, but it normally comes through the research councils. So we have a federated council called UK Research Infrastructure, and it represents each of the funding councils, like the Medical Research Council, the Engineering Council, the Economic and Social, the Humanities. They're all part of that. There's 6 different councils that actually fund science. And each of those on their websites will have kind of data sharing advocacy areas. And they do their own sort of training to help build relationships with their community. So I think that's the best way to do it, is really through the funders, because that's the first place researchers go. And to have it in any contract, to have the links to data sharing within those research grant contracts. I think it's probably the only way to get researchers to really pay attention, I think.
Yeah, the unique practices of Indonesia itself, because most of the funding of research most of them are from governments. So we then also have research institution that covers so diverse science and disciplines. So it might be one big community of practices because covering so many diverse. So we can go to the next questions from Ms. Ria Aryani. She would like to ask about the retention time of research data. Do you know how to handle old physical research data that has historical value for an institution or for a country? Do we have to hold them forever? Can you share any experience about this and about how policies in you work on this issue? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, some data sets or some data have legal restrictions on how long they can be held. And I think in the medical field, you know, records, you have to keep records for a certain amount of time, for example, in hospitals and things. It's always been quite difficult. People are very unwilling to put dates on how long you can keep things for. But I think under things like the Digital Economy Act and GDPR, there are exemptions for storing data for statistical purposes. So actually you can, for historical and research, historical and statistical purposes, data can be kept forever. So that would kind of means that archives and research archives can stay forever, because otherwise it reduces the whole point of them. I think it's very hard to know when data is going to be popular. I mean, we may find that data sets don't get used for 10 years and suddenly people go back to them because there's an area of interest again. They want to go back to do similar things. So, you know, storage is very cheap these days. We don't have to worry about that. So I would say we probably shouldn't put a life on them at the moment. We don't need to. If it comes a point where we need to, then I think we should. But I think we should just keep things indefinitely, as long as it's proportionate. You know, we should be allowed to. We can't just keep things unnecessarily. And if it's personal data, there's a data minimization criteria where you can only keep data for so long. So I think it very much depends on the type of data and what you're allowed to do and what we'd like to do.
Yeah, and I also have read some articles. The title is where do you put your research data 20 years ago? It's like surprise us when we see in 1990s, because most of the research outputs are in the physical one, not digital.
Yeah. They are, and I think my feeling on digitization is there is no point in digitizing data for the sake of it. I think it needs to be a needs sort of process. So the best way is to list it in a catalogue. What we started doing is listing the data sets in a catalogue. There's 10 boxes of data. Here's the methodology. It could have been a very famous study. If you'd like to come and digitize it, please come and do that. And we had quite a few researchers that would visit us. They get a research grant themselves to digitize it all. Then they'll give us the data and they do their research. And it's a very efficient way of doing it because they're paying for it and it's part of their data preparation. So, but if you don't list it, people don't know it's there. But I would say, you know, random digitization can be very expensive and somebody might not use it. So, but you should attempt to list these things in the catalog if you can.
Yeah, just make sure that it's retrievable, so we can make it like fair, findable, accessible, etc. Yes. So we can go to the next question. Do we have common data metrics that is available to see the sharing practices?
I mean, every system has different ones, but there's more and more metrics built in, not only for downloads, because most systems like Dataverse will probably give you number of downloads or number of times people have clicked on a page. So of course you can use Google Analytics to track what people are doing on your pages. But with DOIs, once your data have DOIs, it gives you a lot more power to track what people are doing. And there's a lot of very good metrics tools that can be used with DOIs, like Altmetric. So some of these tools that you can put a badge on to show where your data is being used. So that I think they're fairly standardized tools now. But you know, counting numbers about usage can be very difficult, and we normally do it because we want to tell our funders how well we're doing. So I think we have to be cautious. And also at the data service, I think we agreed not to put metrics on the data sets because people didn't want to be on the bottom of the group. You know, they didn't want to know that their data wasn't popular and someone else's was. So yeah, think very carefully about those sorts of things, the sensitivity around putting this right up front in people's faces. It's an interesting point, I think. Just because you haven't got the top badge doesn't mean your data's not the best or the fairest.
Yeah, maybe because some researchers also care about the metrics, how they perform, like publications, etc. But we about data set, it means that you just make sure that it is available to be reused when someone wants to continue your research. We can go to the next question then. So in Indonesia, we are still developing One Data Indonesia. It means that public open data will be stored in one hub, like DataGov. What do you think about it from localization into a hub? I heard that you've been to Sulawesi. It is one part of island in Indonesia, right? We have so many local regional area in Indonesia. So what do you think about it?
To have things in lots of different places, is that what or to have one? Can you just explain how it might work, what you're thinking, and I can
Yeah, because in some part of the world, they also provide the DataGov, like they put one hub to put some data set to make sure that it is retrievable, findable. And then I heard about DataGov AU by Australian government too. And in Indonesia itself, we're still developing that One Data Indonesia. So is it also implemented in UK or not?
Yes. Well, what's interesting is we set up a data.gov very early using quite old technology, but it wasn't kept up to date. So what happens is there was a big drive for transparency. So many government departments had to have a publication schedule for their open data, and they put data in there. So I think that's the technology is going to be upgraded, but I think it's really important to do. And I remember at one of the IASIS conferences, that's the Association of Social Science Technology, that there's been really interesting progress around the world with open data portals. And I think Mongolia's got one of the most forward-looking open data portals I've ever seen. And I think it's really important to have a data.gov. Yes, I do, with kind of national statistics in there, but also some of the Excel tables underlying that. So they tend to be a very basic catalogue together with Excel data that's available to the public as well. So I do think they're important, but they're a particular kind of data. They're more summary data. Obviously, they can't be kind of, disclosive at all, but I think it's really important to have that information available for citizens to use. Yeah, and it's really good for kind of teaching and learning as well. I'm not sure how much, I mean, it's probably useful for researchers too, but I think generally it's a very good sign that you're being transparent with data. So it's a subset of the other data sets that can sit in repositories like the REAM.
That's that should be the one, because we also want to socialize about REAM Dataverse as one of the repository data that can be used by Indonesian researchers. There is another last question in the Q&A, but I have additional one in my private chat. There is one from Mr. Lukman. Can you explain more clearly about your mention about open research that is not equal to open data?
So I think what I was talking about just now is open research is the set of principles around that you're going to be completely transparent in everything you do. And that's making sure you're ethical, you're meeting the legal obligations for the research and the way you treat participants, as well as what you're going to do with your data. You're looking after your personal data. You're making sure if you do share data, it's done in a legal and ethical way. But I think when it comes to open data, this is the material that we're putting in data.gov. That's the open data. It's the data anyone can use. The data that's going into a controlled environment is far from open. That I would say is not open data. It's controlled data. And it's open in the sense that if you go through all the accreditations, you can use it. But I wouldn't necessarily call it open data. So I think the distinction I make is open is free from any open data, free from any barriers at all. So anyone can use it, anyone can download it. The controlled data or the safeguarded is different. It has restrictions. Not everyone will be able to use it, because some of the personal data I was talking about, you need to have a statistics background, and that's not open for many people who don't have that. So I think they are slightly different things. So you can still be do open science, but put all your data in a controlled environment because of the nature of the data itself. So I think that's, hopefully that's explained what I mean by that.
Yes, so you mentioned about controlled data. Is it like by data steward, someone who managing the data?
Yeah, so control data, I mean, there's a number of different ones. Certainly the UK Data Service, the controlled data sets are versions of surveys that got very disclosive material in. So they will be very low levels of geography, you know, a few houses. They will be really detailed about maybe their educational records, what school they went to, what hospital they've been in. They're very low level things that are disclosive, and there will be versions of those data sets in a controlled environment. Whereas the more open versions will be available for everyone, but they won't have that extra information in. So the difference is really on the granularity and, you know, and the sensitivity of the data. So it's just more data on top of existing open data, I think.
Yeah, it's still the terminology that we need to explore more about that, because that's how we can get the understanding of each yes. The terms of data.
Exactly. Yes.
Well, I have an additional question here. Ms. Untari asked about does data that is open to the public need to be distinguished from raw data? Is this still related to our conversation before?
Yeah. Yes, I don't know whether you ever need to share raw data, to be honest. I think it depends what you mean by raw, doesn't it? Because if you have something coming out of the Hadron Collider, it's really dirty, it's really messy data. You have to do a whole load of processing to get anything that could be useful for research. So aggregation, cleaning. So, you know, part of the research process is messy. I think there's various levels of data, isn't there? Various data cleaning, like the first iteration will be a cleaned up data set that's documented, because the stuff coming out of surveys, you know, out of a survey tool can be really, really messy and not have any labeling. So I would say you need a level of processing to make available. But I think raw data is often quite problematic. I don't think people can make sense of raw data. So again, it depends what you mean by raw data. I would say one level of processing to make sure it's even described on all the missing data is taken out. Or it's explained that it's missing, or you put missing codes in. That level of cleaning that the public probably don't understand needs to explain that you've gone through that process. And then obviously you start to create more derived variables and derived measures that are really useful for people. So they become useful because they've taken someone a long time to create, or to, you know, to put together maybe a history, and that kind of data processing many people can't do. So I think it depends what you mean by raw. So I'm it's probably not very helpful, but I think the ideas of levels of processing of data is really important to think about.
Yeah, it might be the raw data for the social science research. Most of them are like in the audio and need so many sensitivity that need to be clean, anonymity, and etc. So so we still need to distinguish that, how to open and make sure that the raw data is clean. Well, I have a personal question.
Exactly.
So because I'm a research data librarian, so how you personally start the conversation with researchers to build the trust and culture in sharing the data? Because in Indonesia, it's still a long way to go.
I think the first thing is to be an evangelist for data sharing. I'm a very positive person. I think you are too. I think you will go a long way to persuade people, because it's the positivity and excitement, and it's not just a job, it's a passion. I really think that rubs off very well on people. But I think also generic data sharing have some good examples of things that have been shared, so you can go into the detail. I've always found very useful. So I worked very early on this Edwardian study, which was about 450 people were interviewed in 1970, and they were all talked about the time before the end of the 19th century, their lives in villages and things. It was a very large survey that was done with some qualitative work, and that was made available, and actually was used hundreds of times by scholars, and that was really important, to have an example of why it's important to keep stuff, you know, having those really tangible examples, and also be able to name somebody like a Professor X who people knew, to say how they shared their data. So I think when you're starting a conversation, it's not only all those things that you did in your video, which is a really, really good video to show people how important it is. It's having that personal touch, or that that idea that that you understand what you're talking about, so you have some connection with it. Because I think if you're just doing a sales job, it's really difficult. So I have been a researcher, and I am by trade, I've worked in research, and it's just, I think, yeah, having those stories and the passion, I would say, will get you a long way. As well as obviously understanding all the technical questions they're going to ask you, which they will.
Yeah, and of course about the legal questions, because we need to know most of the legal documents, like how the sensitivity and ethics,
yes, exactly,
going on in Indonesia or UK.
Yeah.
It will be different one.
Yeah.
Okay. So, well, regarding the UK policy, UK has started the movement of data policy a long time ago. And so what is the environment like now, related to the reusability, reproducibility practice? Has it become a culture already?
Yeah, I think it's almost accepted, because as part of your grant contract, you've got to do all these things. You have to offer a metadata record to the data archive. People chase you down. So there's that negative side. So you really can't get away from it. It's like you can't get away from impact. You have to keep reporting impact for your whole life, ever since you did a piece of research. I think it's taken for granted and accepted. Not everyone likes it, because really they want to get on to their next research. But there's the understanding that you can build in funds and money to prepare data. And, you know, if you get to the end and do nothing, then that's not received very well. So I think more and more the research councils have been very good at writing to people to say, well, particularly for people who've been very negative or refused to do anything at all. When we were, because we kind of operated a kind of data service support role, a data sharing support role for the research council, giving out grants. And we were charged with speaking to them to start with. And if they were really very negative or didn't engage, we reported them back to the research council. And they wrote them a nice letter saying, you need to take this seriously. If you don't do this properly next time, you won't get any more money. So it really was a scary letter. And they probably wouldn't follow it through, to be honest, because you don't want to stop research. But there's enough to say, oh, I've just got this letter from the research council. What can I do to help? So I think having those sticks in place, you know, even if they're a letter to say, you know, you've done this once, we'd like you to engage more, I think that really works. But I don't think they're sent out very often, those letters at all. Most people will try and share something. And I think even across all of the sciences, it's become accepted that you're probably going to have to be more reproducible with the journals. So a lot of the journals are demanding data sharing, data availability. So people have to think about that a lot more carefully. Not all the journals are there. So some of the sociology journals don't really do that yet, but I do think it's coming in the next couple of years.
Yeah, that's right. Very right. And you're also mentioning about digital economy. I'm very interested with that, because there might be a relation about sharing the data and intellectual property. So what's the maybe license or the regulation that cover it?
I think it very much depends what it is. I mean, if it's data collected in the public good, then that belongs to Crown copyright, belongs to the government. So there's a whole licensing schedule in place for government data. It's called the Open Government License, or so that's quite well thought out. You know, we do have Creative Commons that's used quite a lot in the UK for licensing research data. When it comes to intellectual property, it's always a little bit difficult, because what happens is essentially the person paying for the research, the research council owns the copyright, but they very rarely want to use the copyright. So they delegate it down to the university, who very rarely wants anything to do with it. It's delegated down to the researcher, who will say, I have intellectual rights. The moment anyone makes any money, it's a different story. So the moment a patent happens or somebody creates something like graphene, it was a big thing in Manchester. Somebody invented this graphene, this material, and immediately the university decided they wanted a piece of the rights, and then the funders. So, you know, quite often the research data are not worth anything. You know, we're not talking about multi-millions of pounds, and the copyright industry is all around, you know, intellectual property with things that are worth something like music and recording. So often they don't have an intrinsic value, but the moment they do, you'll soon know about it because everyone will want a piece of the pie.
Yeah.
But yeah, normally it's having a Creative Commons and really understanding if there is anyone that you've used data from that's sold you data or already has a license, you're thinking very carefully about the history of the licensing. And we found that's probably the most challenging thing for researchers. They do not understand licensing. They hate it. They don't want anything to do with it. It's complicated. And so it's having guidance on how to check those things. If you've used data from the internet, don't assume it's open. Go and look at terms and conditions. You can't always share Google Maps, you know, it's got licensing, and it's just opening people's eyes a little bit to that. And I think it is challenging, but yeah, you can have it in your guidance for sure.
Yeah, it's actually implemented in the RIN Dataverse, because in the Dataverse itself, it provides the field of metadata related to the term of use and term of access using the Creative Commons. So the researchers can choose some option related to the data set that is there. Well, I think that's the end of the questions and personal questions that I asked. Thank you so much, Louis. But before we end the session, actually we have the second poll to know about your understanding about this today's topics, and I will try to launch the poll here. So the question is, the first questions, do you know more about RDM from today's event? Because this is the 6th seminars series. And the last one is about research data sharing, because it is at the end of the cycle of research data management, but it still continues because it is a life cycle. And will you consider providing research data services in your institutions if available? Most of it are maybe like academic librarian or research institutions librarians. You might have an interest to provide these services. The third one, will you consider using research data services in your institutions? If available also, if you are researchers and have an interest in providing your data to the public. The last one, will you participate in other RDM webinar series in the future? Maybe because this is the last webinar in this year, we might continue the series on the next year, 2022. So just make sure that you can check up our social media. I think we can end the poll and see the result. Most of them are, have an interest and consideration in using data services. I hope Indonesia and also RIN Dataverse can be one of your platform in determining or implementing data management or good practices in your research. So, ladies and gentlemen, finally, we come to the end of the presentations. We would like to say thanks again to the presenter for her informative and interesting talk. Thank you, Louis.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the audience for your active participation. Hopefully, the presentation will be beneficial for everybody. You can access the recording of the webinar on our YouTube at Kepustakaan PDD LIPI. Then the presented material can be accessed on the link put on the chat. And for your information, we are going to have the 4th International Conference on Documentation and Information in October 2021. You can access our website for further information. Then thank you. I finally and officially close this 6th webinar series. Good afternoon, stay safe and healthy. See you on our next RDM webinar series. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Luis.
See you.
Bye.
Thank
Have
you.
a nice
Bye-bye.
holiday.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Good luck.
You too.